to you. Nigel, Global Head of Marketing and Communications at SLR, an environmental consulting business. Jolyon Ridgwell, Investment Manager specialising in renewables at Blackfinch Investment. Matthew Yeomans, author, and your chair for this session is me, Andy Knox, strategy consultant, and Ned with a sustainable investing business. ESG is everywhere across the investment world. From small-scale impact strategies to the trillion-dollar mega funds club, wealth and asset managers are working hard on their sustainability narratives to ensure both the way they run their own businesses and the way they allocate capital to others communicates as best they can that they are responsible global citizens and not short-term profiteers. So, Matthew, let me turn to you first. 2020 felt like a breakout year for ESG, with UK ESG fund flows quadrupling versus prior year and sustainable fund assets globally hitting a record 1.7 trillion in 2020. The green movement has been bubbling away for decades, but what do you think the key drivers have been in ESG really beginning to hit the mainstream more recently?
Well, obviously the elephant in the room was the pandemic that scared the hell out of companies, investors, and woke people up, not necessarily to climate change and general sustainability issues, but to what a massive disruptive force can do to everyone's life and economy, and that got everyone thinking. But the drivers had been there before and had been kind of starting a couple of years before. And it's a little bit like the old Woodward and Bernstein Washington Post Watergate thing, follow the money. Over the last few years, investors, big investment houses have looked and seen what the future looks like in 3, 4, 5 years' time. And they've seen governments starting to get real about things like the Paris Accord. They've seen regulatory agencies and authorities starting to put into place the mechanisms that will determine how business is going to be conducted over the next few decades. And what they looked at and what they saw, they said, hold on, we've got to get into these areas of sustainability, or ESG, that up until now we didn't really think were material to our core business, but they suddenly are. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, and I guess as a follow-on question, Matthew, is sustainability sustainable itself? There's been so much interest so quickly, it's reached this tipping point. Do you think there's any danger that it burns out, or is it very much here to stay?
Oh, it's 100% here to stay. What you've seen is a huge amount of people talking about it, and ESG, I think we all know, was not a buzzword 18 months ago, and suddenly like everyone is an ESG expert in this thing. What will burn out is the kind of faddish obsession with putting ESG in every single thing. But that's a good thing, because there's just a huge amount of rubbish being talked at the moment, frankly, about it, and a lot of words and not a lot of action. However, the fundamental drivers that will put sustainable business at the heart of everyone's business and investing decision is most definitely here to stay.
Thank you. And let's just pick up on something you just said, Jolyon. I'm going to come to you. So with so much investor capital to go for, there is clearly a much discussed risk of greenwashing. In other words, a rather cynical marketing play rather than a root and branch commitment. Jolyon, just drawing on your expertise in the energy sector in particular, you're obviously more engaged on the renewables side, but you'll have seen some of the pivots that the big oil and gas majors are trying to effect. Can you talk us through what authentic looks and doesn't look like in your book?
I think that you're absolutely right. There is a lot of greenwashing, and there's a lot of drive to increase awareness of what is real, what isn't real, and partly because I think there are two sides to this coin. So where we've got perhaps attractive ESG policies being put forward, you've also got detrimental activities going on. So it might be that there's a lot of good going on in terms of saying, right, we're reducing our carbon outputs or intensity, we're increasing our investment in the right angles, but at the same time, businesses are being harmed in some way. So you're getting, people are losing their jobs. Perhaps people are not, they're seeing their prospects go in the opposite direction. So the big majors, for example, Shell, BP, and so on, have seen that they've got their business opportunities shifting in the wrong direction in some respects, the longevity, and they've had to communicate it very differently and say, right, we're actually going to jump on the bandwagon and do something differently, change their business models. So I think what we're seeing is a fundamental shift that makes it look like they are changing their business models, but it's still business as usual to a certain extent. And I think that's where the slight danger is, that it is greenwashing as such, in that it's the same big businesses and they are putting up a face, whereas the real the deep greens are perhaps sticking with their core principles and running their businesses in what they believe is the right way forward.
And Nigel, I want to come to you in a minute on the education piece, but before we do that, can you just talk about, from your perspective as an environmental consultancy business, because presumably one of the things you're doing as part of that is going in and working with businesses on the ground, possibly also in the oil and gas sector, and saying, how do you make this real, rather than just a marketing tag?
Yeah, and I think there are, the great thing is that there are now some very good industry benchmarks. There are some very good guidance, all starting from the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, but sector by sector, there are good industry standards here. So understanding what your impacts are, understanding where your business is, speaks exactly to Matthew's point about, don't come at this lightly, really understand what you need to do. And if you're going to avoid that greenwashing, then you have to do that. You can't just kind of pick and choose and go, oh, we're going to do something over here or we'll do something over there. You really have to understand where you are today, on what impacts across the sustainability spectrum, across the ESG spectrum, your business is impacting, and that's the perfect starting point.
And without naming names, where have you seen kind of egregious examples of greenwashing, and is there a kind of smell test you kind of developed to know where people are trying to pull the wool over people's eyes?
Yeah, I don't think they're egregious. I don't think people are purposefully trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes or try and dress themselves up in a greener color than they actually are. I think it's naivety or ignorance around their true impact. It's sort of an enthusiasm to sort of say, oh, we're doing something over here, let's go and tell people about it. When in fact, actually, if you take a more measured approach, if you really understand where your environmental, social, and governance risks are, you can actually find that what you might be doing at the moment is good, but you need to do a whole stack of other stuff as well.
Yeah. Okay. And let's turn now to this education piece with levels of understanding rising. I'm just in some of the work that I was doing last year with workplace pensions. It's quite interesting because ESG is seen as a way of getting people to engage with their pensions in a way that they haven't done for years. And for sales guys actually working in pensions, they spent 20 or 30 years being told they've got to explain the difference between a bond and an equity to people in workplace pensions, no interest whatsoever. But when they start to talk in thematic terms to pension scheme members about ESG issues, because they are issues that they see on social media and in debates and discussions they have they have. There's a degree of engagement there, which is refreshing. Can you talk, Nigel, a little bit in terms of do you think the level of sophistication is increasing on ESG, or do you think there are still some basic foundational pieces to be laid?
Well, I'll share two experiences on this. But one personal, from a business point of view. From a personal point of view, I'm great that you brought up the example of workplace pensions, because I've recently been trying to educate my own financial advisor on topics of ESG, who sort of has kind of come to it pretty late, sort of realizing that he is now getting asked these questions by the people that he advises, and used to just having that conversation about, it's what's the difference between a bond and an equity. So I think there is a lot of ground there still to cover. But from a more positive point of view, for anybody that's involved in the resources sector, and we do a lot of work with big mining companies. This week is the largest mining convention globally, usually taking place in Toronto. It's obviously, like everything else, virtual these days. But it is absolutely front and center, not just with the finance community at this convention, but with the miners, both the majors and the mid-tier and the smaller players. And this isn't the conversation a year ago would have been, we've had people coming to us sort of saying, oh, somebody's mentioned ESG, what does it mean? Or, my bank saying I have to do something on ESG, what is it? Now the conversations are, okay, where are my priorities? This is what we're looking to improve on. This is where we need to get to be able to attract the finance or raise the funding that we need for our next project. The conversation and the level of understanding has moved on enormously, but it is well understood and well discussed, I think, by organizations that need to attract funding, need to attract finance. Maybe in other areas it's not so well advanced.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that the whole oil and gas majors question, because as an investor, do you look at them and go, I won't touch them because of several century, well, at least a century of kind of gouging the earth and creating stranded assets, or do you basically say, I want to be part of the change, investing in them as they pivot to create more renewable business? What's your take on that, Nigel?
Yeah, I mean, anybody that's invested in oil and gas in the last 12 months is probably not looking very happy about their returns either way. But I think investors asking the right questions, not avoiding the conversation, but I think all of us asking the right questions and putting our money where our mouths are, or putting our money where our beliefs are, is what will actually shift things. That's what's happening on the aggregate level anyway. That's what's changing the behaviours of both the majors and the miners. Is their investors, is the money asking the questions.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting question around all of this, I think, in terms of investor attitudes about, are there generational differences? I think the conventional narrative runs something like ESG is primarily, or has certainly been driven by millennials and obviously up and coming Gen Zs. But Jolyon, I think you've got an interesting kind of anecdote in terms of suggesting it's actually it's much broader than that. It's a concern that spans the generations, and certainly some of the kind of wealth planning that you see going on among kind of later generations absolutely focuses on ESG.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of our investors are investing in green investments for inheritance tax purposes. So by that fact, they are generally older, and I think it's partly because it's down to awareness and perhaps pressure. We've seen the likes of Greta Thunberg and so on putting the message out there quite loudly. I think the pressure comes upwards from the younger generation to the older generation, and certainly from my own experience, our children are telling us things that we perhaps wouldn't have thought about otherwise. And increasingly, we're seeing our investors who are putting their money into these IHT efficient funds saying, I want to go for the ethical one. And increasingly, the weighting is going towards the ethical, the energy focused side rather than any of the other alternatives. Not to say that the alternatives are less ethical or ESG focused, but that they are not focused purely so on renewable energy investment.
And Matthew, can I just bring you in on that from a kind of macro perspective? ESG and any differences between the generations? Is it owned more by the one than the other?
Look, I mean, there's lots of different elements to this, aren't there? I mean, I think there's most definitely a generational shift, right? And it's coming. Yes, it's on a millennial. Yes, it's on a Gen Z level. But my kids are in their teens, and they're having conversations, and they're thinking about issues in a way that we never thought about. And because it's real to them, and they're seeing it play out, and they're seeing the activities of a pandemic and climate change, they're living it, they're playing it out, and this is their future. That becomes a very, very important thing. But it becomes a very important thing in terms of the world of business when you start trying to recruit new graduates into your companies. If you are now in the world of big oil, you're finding it unbelievably difficult to recruit the type of talent who even a decade ago you would have done. Even tech companies are having issues, because of their issues around privacy and things. They're having a hard time kind of getting the right caliber of people if those people and that generation don't believe in the values or where they think that the companies are kind of operating or investing. And frankly, that's going to be the case for professional services as well. Professional services, the big four, together probably recruit more people each year than any other industry sector. If those companies and those firms aren't living up to the values of the people who used to go into them, they're not going to get the talent either. So it's not just on an investment side, it's on what is the fabric of our working society look like, and how do you value the places you want to kind of be part of?
Yeah. So let's turn now to the thought leadership space specifically, and obviously I think what goes with massive interest in the space and a lot of fundraising is it's a crowded space. We talked a little bit about authenticity there, but how are firms identifying niches that they can own within the ESG space from a thought leadership perspective? And are there formats and channels in ESG related thought leadership that you can use to stand out? Jonathan, I'm going to come to you first just to hear about some of the stuff from the client work that you've been doing.
So I think the answer to that question depends largely on the angle you're coming from. So if you're an oil and gas firm, it's very different to if you're a PE firm or a legal firm or an accountancy firm. But in general terms, yeah, absolutely. It's such a crowded space. ESG is a hot topic everyone wants to talk about, and you really need to be authentic and be able to back up what you're saying. Audiences have always been discerning, but it's much, much easier to scrutinize companies these days than it's ever been. And as you said, there's often a big difference between, kind of brand values, what companies are doing, what they're saying they're doing in their thought leadership. So it's important to be really mindful of that. Skeletons in your closet. You're unlikely to cut through the noise, get the traction you want from a thought leadership campaign by being part of an echo chamber, talking in general terms about the rise of ESG in your firm, the amazing things you're doing over here, when there are some not so amazing things you're doing over there. So I think firms really need to think about their commercial objectives, play to their strengths, and understand what they can talk about authentically and what they can't talk about authentically. In terms of formats, I think everyone needs to be mindful of how people are consuming information at the moment. So the days of issuing long reports are by no means done. But in terms of thought leadership, if you want to be successful, we need to be really conscious of how everyone's circumstances have changed. So creative, bite-sized digital outputs need to be part of campaigns more so than before. Given that most people are at home, they're not commuting when they typically read reports like that, or sitting in waiting rooms before meetings.
Okay, and I think, and I guess going back to the point, Nigel, we were talking about pensions, but I mean not to overdo that point, but in terms of reaching people and connecting with them and making sure they make informed choices. I mean, in terms of the thought leadership you do, which I guess it might be a bit more B2B, I don't know, but are there particular hot areas at the moment? If we think of ourselves a year in, 18 months into this kind of second coming, as it were, of ESG, what are the kind of typical areas that you reach for in terms of ESG thought leadership?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting area, and as you said, how you find your niche. Jonathan and I are working on some stuff together at the moment, where we're looking in a particular industry sector and trying to understand within that sector what are the ESG topics that are right at the top of the agenda. I think the advantage that there is there, particularly for the professional advisory perspective, is that this is a broad agenda, and we've gone beyond the point of kind of high level generalities. So people do want to know about specifics. They do want to know, as Matthew mentioned at the beginning, about how do you translate ideas into practical action. So you can find your niche because you can latch on to a topic and give really practical advice and understand where your clients are and what they're prioritizing. So because it's such a broad agenda, I think thought leadership has tremendous potential, because you can uncover, you can discover what people are really interested in. I think the risk is that you stay at that general level of, isn't ESG terribly important? Isn't it, transformational? I think people from a thought leadership point of view, you need to start to not go into the weeds because you'll lose people, but you need to get into details. But there's a huge canon of opportunities out there to go after.
Yeah, and do you think there is that thirst for information, that hunger for insight on the part of retail as well as institutional audiences? Because obviously, if you think about investing, institutional audiences are deeply into this, partly because their own investors are requiring them to do so. But on the retail side of it, just going back to your conversation with the IFA, do you think the conversation you're having with the IFA, albeit from a kind of more of a kind of expert, informed industry participant point of view, do you think others are also turning to IFAs and saying, look, I want to invest my money, I want to get a decent return, but I want to sleep at night knowing I'm not?
Yeah, and I think you could have people that are sort of saying, right, as with Jolyon's funds and interests, I'm particularly interested in climate impacts, in decarbonisation, in terms of green energy. You will equally have people that are sort of saying, right, what's really important to me is social equity, is diversity in the workplace, is the impacts that companies have on local communities in developing nations. People, you don't have to, this isn't a plain vanilla one size fits all agenda, and people will pick and choose. So you do need to understand the full suite, but then funds will be able to target, investors will be able to target into areas that particularly interest them or particularly help them get to sleep at night.
Yeah, thanks. And I saw you nodding furiously there, Jolyon. Can you walk us through a little bit how your interactions with IFAs and I guess their audiences, it plays out from a Blackfinch perspective?
I think it's almost like having a bit of a journey with these people, because when you're trying to sell something to them, it's clear that none of us is perfect, and even the best players in this sector are still open to criticism. And so taking the investors, the participants on a journey with you so they can feel actually we're learning along the way and we're trying to identify ways to make our contribution more beneficial. It is sort of a way of involving them and engaging them to an extent, which I think people like. It's a bit like if you've got oil companies or energy companies, traditional thermal energy companies in your pension investments, and you drive along the motorway and you see a big power station, you don't look at it and think with pride, gosh, I own some of that smokestack. Whereas if you see a wind turbine or solar panels or EV charging points at the side of the road, you think, oh, I've got a bit of that in my pension, and it's something to be slightly proud of. And I think it's all part of that journey as increasingly it becomes more business as usual and routine as we get better at it. It also gives investors an opportunity to articulate what it is that increasingly matters to them. And I think, as Nigel said, very good point, that it's not just about the energy sector, it's about all sorts of other things, whether it's having underpaid people in sweatshops in less developed countries. It's there's a lot that we can do to contribute to the improvement.
That's great, thanks, Jolyon. So we're coming up almost to the end of our slot here, and conscious that some of the audience may need to leave. But we're gonna close by coming back to a little topic that Matthew tantalisingly referred to earlier, and which I think might be actually quite relevant to a fair number of the audience, which is this interesting positioning of advisors on the ESG narrative. And I guess going back to that point on authenticity, for professional services firms in particular, are there real challenges here? So if you look at the model, strip out cash every year rather than invest for the long term, and perhaps more fundamentally lucrative transactional litigation fees as advisors coming from big oil, etc. How do they navigate those kind of conflicts, Matthew?
Oh, great, thanks. Well, again, it comes down to, doesn't it? I mean, if you're talking about how do professional services firms talk with authority and authenticity around elements of ESG, well, they have to be open. They have to demonstrate they have the knowledge, the leadership, but also the expertise in particular areas of that. But they also they do really have to be candid, and they have to be aware of maybe where their own weaknesses are. It's fair to say that probably on the issue of global tax, that a lot of kind of professional services companies over the years haven't actually been kind of, top of their game on that. And that's something they have to be aware of. But that doesn't necessarily stop them from understanding and being able to talk about the priorities of the UN SDGs in regard to their client base. There is no black and white in this. Everything is grey. Everyone is learning. Everyone is making mistakes along the way. But it is demonstrating that you understand how the whole big picture is going. And I think one of the problems sometimes is that we are going down too linear a route, too tactical a route about this is what we do in ESG without actually stepping back. And I think professional services firms can do a good job in this without stepping back and saying, why does this actually matter to your business? Why does this matter to this investment fund? What is it going to look like in 5 years' time? Unless you understand, unless you put the component parts of environmental social governance together, because they all work together. This whole thing works together because we're in a system. And I think sometimes because of the breadth of these firms, they're able to kind of do that.
Yeah, and I think that concept of a system or a community is very live, because what I've seen in some of the stuff I work on is counterparties want to know that they are dealing with other counterparties who are responsible citizens and are putting their shoulder to the wheel too. I mean, Nigel and or Jonathan, anyone jump in. Do you think clients are increasingly putting pressure on on their professional advisors to understand how they are doing their bit, how their businesses are set up to be doing the right things.
Absolutely, because ultimately ESG sustainability, there are a lot of supply chain issues in here, and whilst we might, as a professional services firm, your environmental impact in particular may not be significant, your stance, your sense of purpose, your authenticity that Matthew was talking about is going to be important, and organizations increasingly know, particularly the big players, big industrials, the big energy firms, know that it's not just about what goes on within their realm that is important here. It's what goes on right along their supply chain, right through to how their products and services are used by their customers. So they're managing a process, as Matthew said, they're managing a system. So they increasingly of the view that everybody in that system needs to be aligned, and therefore they are going to move towards professional advice that maps to their ethics, that maps to their view of the world.
Yeah, and Jonathan, does that resonate in terms of what some of you're seeing what you're seeing in terms of some of the clients' positioning on ESG?
I would say so. I think we're getting into the realms of mutually assured destruction if we start judging historical behavior of professional services firms by today's ESG standards. But absolutely, it's gone massively up the agenda. There's ESG components in RFPs and tenders that everyone sees that would never have come around before. And I think it's going to be influenced by talent a lot as well. So, just like we were talking about how tech firms and oil and gas firms may struggle with talent, to attract the brightest and best, they need to be, operating at the highest standards of ESG, and that's going to permeate throughout professional services in the next few years, I think.
Great. Okay, well, look, I'm seeing that we're getting some people who are needing to leave us now, and we've run over a little bit. So, look, I think I'll probably wrap it up there. I mean, it's obviously the case that, as I said at the top of the session, this is very much just a taster. I mean, all of these issues we could have spent 3 hours talking about. ESG itself is often referred to as a kind of monolith, but in reality, we know the E of environmental, the S of social, and the G of governance are all individual topics in their own right. But look, I think it just remains me to thank very much our panelists, Matthew, Nigel, Jolyon, and Jonathan.